The Battle of Isandlwana, 22nd of January 1879, one of the most famous defeats in British military history, and it was fought right where I'm standing now. This is the mountain behind me. Everybody knows the story of the battle, but what about the aftermath? What happened after the battle had finished? Most historians end the story of Isandlwana at the moment of disaster, the shattered line, the broken rally squares, the Zulu victory. But the real horror came after, when the Martini-henrys fell silent and the thick smoke cleared. What was left was something far darker: chaos, confusion, and an incredible and inspiring kind of courage. Or was it? One man, one rifle, one cave behind me here on Isandlwana mountain. Maybe you've heard of the story of the last survivor of the 24th Regiment of Foot, how he got himself to this cave and put up a brave last stand. Is it true? Today we're going to look at the evidence and find out if indeed there was a final battle here, or was it just Victorian mythologizing, a painting that doesn't really tell the whole story. By 1:30, the camp at Isandlwana was collapsing. Zulu witnesses later said the redcoats fought like lions, but they were massively outnumbered, surrounded, and being picked off in small groups. The Zulus swarmed in like a living tide of angry warriors. Cattle were killed or driven off, the tents ripped open, men's bodies stabbed time and time again as the Zulus performed their traditional battle rituals on enemy dead. And those who could still run ran, on horseback down towards the Buffalo River. Lieutenant Melville of the 1st 24th chose to try and save the Queen's colour, that famous act of doomed gallantry that ended with him and Lieutenant Coghill dead here on the Natal bank and the colours lost in the river. By 2:30, the last resistance in the camp was basically over, and yet up on the mountainside a small group of redcoats was still fighting for their lives. So you can only imagine the exhaustion the men felt battling their way across here down to the shoulder of the mountain. Absolute carnage, blood everywhere, the sound of shooting, the sound of stabbing, the war cries of the Zulus, the cheers of the British. It must have been absolutely horrifying. So this cairn of stones halfway up Isandlwana mountain is here for the men of C Company, Captain Younghusband's company, who had fought their way around these slopes and they'd got to here. By this point, they were out of ammo. They were out of hope. They looked down, all they could see was defeat. It's said that they turned to one another, they shook hands, they gave one last cheer, and they charged down the hill to their certain death. Balls of steel, men amongst men. It was a mad, magnificent gesture, a bayonet charge against thousands. The Zulus later said they admired the courage even as they cut them down. When the British returned to the battlefield a long time afterwards, the bodies of Younghusband and his men were still piled together. No retreat, no surrender, just one final rush into history. But as legend goes, one soldier didn't die there. One man kept fighting, alone. The story goes that after Younghusband's charge, one man, maybe from Younghusband's company, maybe not, scrambled up to a small cave near the southern shoulder of the mountain. He was exhausted, bleeding, perhaps half mad with fear. But from there, he fought on. Calmly and deliberately, it's said that he shot every Zulu who tried to reach him until his ammo ran out. A Dublin painter, Richard Moynan, later immortalised the scene in The Last of the 24th. A scene tailor-made for Victorian sentiment, one lonely hero defiant to the end. Perfect for the parlours of empire. But was it true or just wishful thinking? The British imagination trying to turn horror into heroism. Some say the man fought until the shadows were long on the ground, possibly as late as 5 p.m. One account claims that he fixed his bayonet and charged to his death once he'd fired his last bullet. A Zulu account, and one that I think is probably more believable, says that he stayed tucked inside the cave and was such a nuisance that eventually they brought up a number of sharpshooters who fired a volley into the cave and killed him. There are later reports that his body was eventually found when the British returned to camp and that it had a rope around his neck. Was he captured, perhaps executed? Unlikely, that wasn't the Zulu way. More realistic is that they might have used a rope to pull his body from inside the tiny cave so that they could strip it and perform hlomula, which is multiple warriors stabbing a brave foe. Now, there are many caves here, dozens of hiding places. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. But there's something about this story that sticks, a single man's stand against the impossible. And so at the end of the day, we don't know who the guy was. We don't know if this is the right cave. We don't know if he was from Younghusband's company. There's a lot we don't know. What we can probably say is that someone did put up a brave last fight in one of these caves, and whoever he was, his bravery echoes through eternity. Supreme defiance or desperate self-preservation, maybe a bit of both. But the death of the man in the cave is not the end of today's drama. There's a lot more still to come, including the horror of the night. While the camp was still being overrun, Lord Chelmsford was miles away, hunting an enemy that had already outflanked and outmaneuvered him. At first, he dismissed reports of the fall of the camp, but by the time he started to believe them, it was too late. As he marched back, he met riders bringing the worst possible news: the camp's been taken. He expressed his disbelief, reportedly exclaiming, "But I left over 1,000 men to guard the camp." Before the final advance, Chelmsford addressed his men, acknowledging the catastrophe. "Men," he said, "the enemy has taken our camp. Many of our friends must have lost their lives defending it. There's nothing left for us now but to fight our way through, and we must fight hard, for we will have to fight for our lives." It's said that the men responded positively, cheering and confirming, "All right, sir, we'll do it." Classic British redcoat mentality. At 7:45 p.m, about half a mile from the camp, the column halted, fixed bayonets, and the artillery fired shrapnel shells into the camp. The only reply was a death-like silence. So they advanced further and fired random volleys into the darkness without a response. The Zulus had left. So here on the battlefield, these cairns give a sense of the number of casualties. The dead were everywhere. There was British soldiers, there were civilian wagon drivers, of course there were Zulus. It was an absolute charnel house. Chelmsford and his men returned not just to a battlefield, but to a graveyard. Sergeant Warren wrote home that you could not move a foot either way without treading on dead bodies. But there was nowhere else to sleep, and so the men bivouacked among the dead. No food, no water, surrounded by corpses and ghosts. Few men slept. Who could, after what they'd been through and what they knew was around them here? To make it worse, there was no firewood, there was nothing to eat. The men were starving. It had been an incredibly long day. And to make it worse, they didn't know if the Zulus were about to return. One man called it the longest, blackest night of his whole life. And he wasn't exaggerating. It was pitch dark. The air stank of blood. Every gust of wind sounded like movement in the grass. The men were cold, hungry, and terrified. So it was just before dawn on the 23rd of January when Lord Chelmsford gave the order for the survivors to withdraw back down this wagon trail behind me towards Rorke's Drift. They were shattered, broken, hollow-eyed, but they'd learnt a valuable lesson. And the lesson was that the Zulus were actually a very tough opponent who needed to be respected. This was going to be a much longer, harder war than they'd thought. Through the grey dawn, the shattered column trudged back down the wagon trail towards Rorke's Drift, 10 miles of silence, the dead lining the path. Bizarrely, they passed a Zulu force on the way, but both sides just stared at each other, too exhausted to fight. And then, against all expectation, they saw redcoats on the walls of Rorke's Drift. The post had held. The men cheered, hollow-eyed and starving, but alive. Isandlwana changed everything. From that day on, prisoners were rarely taken. The British response was swift, brutal and merciless. The Zulus had won their greatest victory, but in so doing, they'd kind of sealed their fate. To save face, the British would now have to return and destroy them. And the Zulus made it easy for them. They couldn't adapt their tactics, and they were unable to repeat the surprise. And the empire that they had humiliated came back with a vengeance. Standing on this mountain, you can still feel the weight of it all, the courage and horror rolled into one. Somewhere up there, maybe a lone man once held out with rifle and bayonet, defying death for just a few minutes longer. No retreat, no surrender. Just one man in a cave, alongside the ghosts of Isandlwana. Just a reminder that I do run tours of the battlefields, so if you want to come with me in 2026 or beyond, just join my mailing list over at redcoathistory.com/newsletter. When you do that, you'll also get a free ebook all about the Battle of Isandlwana, and I'll keep you posted for upcoming tours. In the meantime, have a watch of the video that's on screen now. Me and my old mate YouTube think you're going to like it.